And we are live. Hello, everyone. My name is Françoise Mutute. I am so excited to be here to talk about one of my favorite books. Look at all of the notes here. Uh, I'm so excited. So, where do I start? I'm going to start by saying thank you to Adventures Live Festival for bringing this space where we can be ourselves fully to talk about one of the most taboo things that we are told we can never talk about and give us the freedom and the space to do that. Welcome, everyone. And thank you to Nana Darkoa for a beautiful sex lives of the African women and for being here and for inviting me to facilitate this conversation. Thank you so much to you, Poetra Santewa, for being here. And thank you, Fatima, for coming to read with us, but also for all the work you've done to put this beautiful festival. So this is a session about this book, which I love, by Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah. And what we'll do today is to talk about the sex lives of African women, the book, the stories, but also how it resonates with the times we are in today and with our own lives. But we'll start with some readings, after which we will all introduce ourselves a bit more in a bit more detail and start some conversations. So, shall we start? Fatima, do you want to do some reading for us first?
Okay, I'm reading from the book Freedom, from the chapter Freedom. I feel most free when I am myself, stripped of all pretenses, lounging naked on my bed, my boobies freely rolling to wherever they choose to land, my belly relaxed and soft, my thighs apart, my hands wherever they may choose to lie. With no one around me, I am my most free self. I also feel free when I am with my feminist sisters, when I can speak my truth without fear of being judged, questioned, or cancelled. When we think of freedom, it is easy to imagine that it is a far off distant place, but in reality, we can all be free in the here and now. We achieve freedom when we let go of the weight of societal expectations and we find our people, those who love us, care for us, and hold us up when we start slipping. The women featured in this section show that there are many ways to be free in sexual relationships. It is no accident that a vast majority of women featured are from the lesbian, bisexual, and trans community and or practice polyamory. These are women who have resisted societal norms of compulsory heterosexuality and monogamy and have searched both within and without for other ways of practicing love. In my conversation with Fatou of Senegal, she kept reiterating how she would always say to new partners, I am a free woman. This was a constant refrain because new lovers would often try and reshape her into something she was not and demand monogamy when they knew she was polyamorous. For Alexis, freedom came with the wisdom and experience of age, as well as meeting a partner in her 60s who, like her, is comfortable playing with masculinity and femininity. For Gabriella, diving deep into a spiritual practice brought her to a place where she could create relationships that were freer. Freedom is not a destination that one arrives at and can choose to stay at forever and ever. Freedom is a constant state of being, an energy and state that we need to nurture and protect. Freedom is a safe home that one can return to over and over again.
Thank you so much, Fatima. So beautiful. Um, we're now going to hear from you, Poetra, about a little bit from the story of Bibi.
So I'm reading Bibi. I'm just going to read a page and a half just so we have a brief idea about her story. Bibi is a 35-year-old Nigerian woman who describes herself as straight and cisgendered. Zach came to meet me at the taxi rank, and we took a motorbike to where he was staying. It was one of those big fancy expat houses in Cotonou. I remember thinking, wow, it's so good to see you, to be around you, spend time with you. We went out for dinner, and when we got back, we both fell asleep. We woke up in the middle of the night and started chatting. Chatting turned to kissing. We started with closed mouth kisses, then open mouth kisses. I remember falling off the twin bed. We laughed, pushed the beds together again, rolled over to one side and continued kissing. He started to touch my boobs, stroke my clit, and started going in and out with his fingers. I had gotten an IUD before leaving for Nigeria, and when he was going in and out, it started to hurt, almost like he was hitting the IUD. Stop. He kept going. I got more and more turned on. He reached out for a condom and continued to kiss me. He tried to put his penis inside me and it wouldn't go in. I couldn't turn my brain off. Shit, what's happening? Why is this not working? What's going on? Is this still the right thing to do no matter what? It's not like he's my boyfriend, we are just friends. What are you doing? This was one of my fears. I just wanted it to happen. I was someone I really cared about. I was really turned on and thinking, let's go, let's do this. But my vagina was like, sorry, dude. I didn't want to say anything, but I had to. This is my first time. I'm feeling a bit worried and scared. What do you need? We'll take it slow. We'll take it easy. We'll make it good. I'm grateful that my first experience was with him. I wanted to feel normal and for it to feel okay. And it did. It had taken me years to get here, but finally, at the age of 32, I had technically gone all the way. I had managed to do this in spite of all the voices in my head, in spite of the repression, in spite of a sense of shame.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Poetra. It's, every time I take a page or in our hearing, I have even more goosebumps. Thank you. I'm about to read about the page from the story from Shanita, who is a 36-year-old heterosexual woman born in the US and with origins from the Caribbean. And as an act of self love, she decided to practice 100 days of celibacy. Okay, so I read now. Previously, I was so distracted by men, relationships, and desires of the flesh. Now I can see the reward of patience and sacrifice. I've learned so much about myself. I never realized how much self control I had for a start. I now know that I'm able to stick to my goals. I also love the way, I also love the new me that emerged. I used to find the old me annoying. She was a shopaholic, constantly spending money and partying. Being celibate was not just about sex, it was also about breaking free of all forms of distraction and delving deep into myself so I could understand why I used these as a crutch. I wasn't ever extreme when it came to sex. I wasn't a sexaholic, for instance. I was a serial monogamist, and I often found myself staying in relationships way after I should have moved on because of my desire for the other person. A few years ago, I was in a situationship with a man. We had fun, we had a lot in common, we also had friendship. When that relationship ended, I had to ask myself some tough questions. Why do I constantly end up in this kind of situation? What is it about me that I need to change? so I don't end up with someone who doesn't want me as much as I want them. I decided to spend some time retreating into myself. I read a lot. I prayed a lot. I sat through many dark nights until I had the realization I am the light. Nana, can we hear from you, Madam Author?
It's so nice hearing my book read. I'm really enjoying it. Thank you so much, Poetra, Francoise, and Fatima. I'm going to read a little bit from Fatu's story. She's a 60-year-old bisexual woman from Senegal who lives as a polyamorous woman, and the story is really about how she's negotiated her sexuality whilst living in a conservative Muslim majority society. Freedom has always been important to me. In all my relationships, I would always try other men. Sometimes women too, but not that many because I think relationships with women tend to become the most complicated ones. I found that most women were possessive and would not understand that I loved them but still wanted to sleep with someone else. When it comes to possessiveness, I think women are more fierce than men are. I never hid who I was. But whenever I initially told a new lover about being attracted to someone else, they would think I was joking. I would just keep saying to them, I am a free woman. I started most relationships while still in a relationship with someone else, but that same person would turn around and demand that I be faithful to them. I would just say, when you met me, I was with someone else and you knew about that. So I'd just go for what I wanted. Sometimes we could talk about it. Other times it became a lot of drama, and sometimes people would say, I cannot be in a relationship like this, and would leave when I got attracted to someone else. But I never lied about my feelings. Never. That was important to me. I didn't want to lie about being free. And even my kids and sisters knew what kind of woman I was. Sometimes my sisters would say, it's against religion. My kids grew up with me, so although I didn't speak to them directly about polyamory, I lived my life and they saw it, even if it was clear to them that this was not what every woman was like. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. I think it's great to start the conversation about the book by the book. But I do think we need to back up a little bit and introduce ourselves. So maybe I'm going to start very briefly. My name is Francoise Mudute. I'm a fan of this book. I'm a feminist, and I'm at work the CEO of the African Women's Development Fund. In my other time, I'm the founder of Ayala, and the rest of the time, I'm a wannabe free woman, inspired by this by this book even more to do so. Um, Nana Darkoa, can you please introduce yourself a little bit?
I would also say I'm also a wannabe free woman. And I myself am also inspired by stories like Fatu's by Alexis. I feel very much like I'm on a journey of discovery, and part of how I figure out the world around me is by, writing and reading and thinking and having conversations with other women. So this book is a product of that. I'm a feminist activist. I'm a communication strategist. Um, in my, I guess, in my paid work, I work for the Association for Women's Rights and Development as a director for communications and tactics. I'm also the co-founder of Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, um, which is the platform that's bringing today's festival. So super excited to have you all here.
Thank you, Nana. Poetra? Can everyone hear Poetra?
I too am a
Yes.
wannabe free woman. The hear me? What's happening?
Please go ahead, Poetra. You just have a little bit of delay, but we
Um,
can hear you.
Hello? You can hear me now. Okay. So I am Poetra Santoa. I'm a poet, writer, performer, and I use writing to figure out the world. That's how I'm wired. I too am a wannabe free woman. I am the founder of Black Girls Glow, which is an organization that uses art to look at ways in which we can improve our society, ways in which women can have space to talk, curate, create, and share their world. And so, yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much. So, for this conversation, I wanted to start with you, Nana. And I noticed something because I've seen a few copies that you've signed of your book, and you always sign to freedom. Tell me more about why this book about sex is really about freedom.
It's a great question. And because you've bought so many copies for friends, that's how you've seen my standard signature. Yes, because my standard signature is to our collective sexual freedom. And all those words, they are very important to me, because I feel like for us as individuals to be free and our collectives and our societies that we live in, we must be free. We should be in countries that respect our human rights, countries that allow us our freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. I think that's important part of sexual freedom. And I feel like if the society is not open-minded and non-judgmental, it's important for individuals in the society to be free. And freedom is just like, I think my highest value is the thing that I value above all else. If ever I'm in a situation and I suddenly feel restricted or constricted, whether that's in a relationship or even in like a job, I just need to go. I just need to leave. And I just think it's like the fundamental, it's the basis of everything in life, you know? Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's really resonates for me also because I think freedom is, for me, the core value for me as a feminist. And I think I hear a lot about feminism being about equality, and for me, it's really about freedom. So that's also why this really resonates with me. The book, the whole approach to freedom, all the different approaches and understandings of freedom. And I think because sex in particular has been something that has been used against us to restrict our freedom. I think what I really love most about your book is that is reclaiming our freedom through our sexuality. So thank you so much for this offering. Poetra, I want to ask you, as a writer, as an artist yourself, how did you react to the book when you first read it? What was your main first impression when you read it? I'm sorry, I see Poetra, you're speaking, but I can't hear you. So I think we were joking just before now that we should make sure that neither electricity or internet plays with us. But I can't hear you right now. Maybe you can try and come back and see if it gets better. And
My
in the
main
meantime,
first impression was joy, to be honest. It was joy at seeing the different ways in which freedom was being defined for the different women. It's just seeing so many ways in each.
oh, she's disappeared. I hope she's coming back soon because I want to hear about that joy thing. But for now, I wanted to ask you, Nana. I was talking with this book, as you said, I have made it my mission for this year that everybody needs needs to read your book. So I've been your unofficial publicist, etc. And one of the discussions I was having with a friend was about how, for me, what is really important about this book, among other things, is that we've been socialized and educated as women, African women, Black women, that we are sexual favors, and this reminds us that we are sexual beings. And I think for me, I could sense that in the stories, but also even the choices that you made of not, of showing directly the stories, hearing directly from the voices and that diversity. Can you tell me a little bit how I want to say like the artistic choices you made uh, for presenting the stories were in line with like your bigger kind of message? It feels like nothing is like random here. So tell us a little bit what you were trying to do.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the artistic choices I made was to, first of all, use the first person and telling each woman's story. So in terms of a process, I would meet with, you know, someone, have a conversation with them, and everybody's conversation was different. Some people's conversation was like an hour and a half over Zoom. Some people, it was like several face-to-face meetings, right? And then afterwards I'll sort of sit back and reflect on that conversation and think, okay, what was the nugget here, what was the story? And I chose to, in a sense, try and embody each person and tell the story in the way that I had had it, but also in the way that resonated, and also what felt to me like the most compelling aspect of the story. And because I knew I wanted to, in a sense, use creative nonfiction techniques, I would ask people to give me a lot of details. So they may be describing to me, making love with someone, and I'll be like, how did that feel? What else was going on? Where was this happening? Because I really, in a sense, wanted each woman to speak for herself. And because the women were not individually writing their stories, I wanted to be able to write those stories as if I was them. And that was really fun and enjoyable, because it also meant I got to get into other people's bodies and try and experience the world a little bit from where they are. And that was a lot of fun.
It was really fun to read too, and I think one of the reactions I had when I read the stories, I think I was telling you this as well, was it's really like we take the book and it's about sex. Like it's very explicitly about the sex lives of African women. But it's also expanding the definition of sex and sexuality. So I read earlier from the story of Shanita, who was talking about not having sex. And there's like just like all that richness of what we mean when we mean sex. And then a lot of it is about love, a lot of it is about friendship, a lot of it is about self. And so I was wondering, what does that tell us about our understanding of sex, that we have such a restricted view of it? What did you learn about that from doing this work?
I mean, I think sex is really expansive, right? And you've hit the nail on the head. In general terms, we tend to think of sex in very limited ways. We tend to think of sex as penetrative. We tend to think of sex as, only the acts that happen between heterosexual people, usually a man and a woman. We think of sex as penis and vagina. We don't think of sex in broad terms as the intimacy, as the love, as even the friendship. We don't think also about, you know, even celibacy as part of the sexual spectrum. And for me, that's what was great about speaking to like so many women, because you got to see sex through their eyes, and you got to see that sex is really expansive, in the same way that the heart is expansive, which is one of the things that Estelle, one of the women I interviewed in the book, said, and it really stayed with me. That was one of her realizations when she came to understand herself as a pansexual polyamorous woman, that really her heart is expansive. And in the same way, I think we should think of sex in expansive ways. I think that will also allow us to access more pleasure. For a lot of women, penetrative sex is not pleasurable, and people think, oh, somehow I don't have good sex because I don't enjoy penetrative sex. But if you think of sex as, the things that we tend to think of as foreplay, which for me is really main play, as touching, as cunnilingus, as oral sex, as, cuddles, I think it just allows you to, yeah, access more pleasure and to recognize that pleasure as a legitimate type of sex.
Thank you, Nana. Poetra Asantewa, welcome back. You were talking earlier about joy as your first reaction to the
Thank
book. Tell us more.
you. Yeah. Yes, for me, it was just really joyful to see these different expansive views of freedom. Like Nana said, freedom in our sexualities, freedom in our heart. That sexuality wasn't just restricted to body, or it wasn't just restricted to penetrative sex. And even in the examples that we read, Bibi and Shanita, that for some, freedom was breaking out, and for some, freedom was breaking in, was to just find out, for instance, Bibi, that for Bibi for herself that the way that she had been raised had affected even her brain, how she was thinking about sex, to even relate to her body, how she was responding to sex. And for Shanita, it was taking this decision that I am going to not engage in sex, not just sex with somebody else, but sex with myself as well. And so just the different ways in which freedom was expressed, it was just joyful to see that expression. It was really something else to just see that expression in different women and to even see the similarities of like one woman with a polyamorous polyamorous woman and a monogamist woman having similar explanations or similar viewings of what to just see those different expressions. And for me, so that was my first reaction to the book, just seeing these different.
Thank you so much, Poetra. I don't know if everybody can hear Poetra well. I could hear you a little bit, sometimes in and out, but I could make everything. But I'm just asking people in the back if there's something that you can do to fix this. Please let us know, or that we can do, please let us know. But Poetra, thank you so much for offering that. Nana Darkoa, I want to ask you about the reactions to the book. I think I've seen you putting the book together a little bit, and we talked about that. And then suddenly it was out. It was out there. It was beautiful. And then people engaged with it. And so I'm just wondering, um, as you were having conversations around the book, and you've been traveling, you've been talking to a lot of people, book clubs, all of that. What is maybe the one question that you keep getting, and how do you react to that?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. Like, what's the one question? I think what comes to mind most easily is the one thing that people keep saying to me. For me, what has been really, really heartwarming is the fact that so many African women seem to be resonating with the book. So I have people tell me a lot, thank you for this book. I'm going to gift it to my daughter. And something that's been quite unexpected for me are people buying the book for their mothers and their aunties. That's been like such a pleasant surprise. And that's also something that's it's also been like a question that people have asked me, and I've also like shared as a tip. People have said, like, we've never been able to speak to our moms about sex. How can we speak to our moms about sex? I'm like, give her the book, ask her to read it, and have a conversation. I think a question that I also got asked recently when I was at Africa Rights, which is a literary festival in the UK, was were there any sort of differences between the experiences of African women on the continent and African women in the diaspora, when it comes to sex and sexualities? I personally haven't found a huge difference. I think the major difference is obviously context. And that even on the continent, people's local context, whether they're from South Africa or Zimbabwe or Ghana or Kenya, obviously shapes their upbringing. But in general, I found more similarities than differences. A strong similarity being the fact that many people did not have access to sex education growing up. Many people felt restricted by their religion. Those are some of the commonalities I've seen.
Yeah, and I was thinking about also the reactions. Um, oh, sorry, you're on mute and your lips are moving, so I'm not
No,
sure if
it's,
it's
it's okay. I'm trying to tell my mom that I think my daughter's awake.
multitasking. All right. Well, I'm going to wait a second for Nana to come back
Let's
to
go.
us.
No, no, don't worry, don't worry.
All right. Okay. So one of the things that I heard as I've in my discussions about this book has been people being surprised, hearing new things, or in the conversations from the books about the book, discovering new perspectives about sexuality, and And like there are some really like things that we have not surprises because we know like all those perspectives exist, right? But it's more like we don't get to hear from the women having those experiences. I was wondering, hearing about that element of surprise. For us who may not have those conversations often, yes, we are surprised. But I kept thinking about you because you've been doing this work and having those conversations and doing this writing for a long time, and through the blog that led to this festival. And I'm wondering, did you get any element of surprise at any point in this process? Are you still getting surprised?
I know. I mean,
After
12 years writing, talking, having conversations about sex is anything that's surprising me. I mean, there was something that surprised me throughout this process when I started interviewing women. It was the number of women who had experienced child sexual abuse. That was a surprise. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I didn't expect that to be almost every woman's experience. And in my initial conversations, there was a question I'd ask people, and a lot of the time it would actually, I felt, trigger, them to tell me about an experience of child sexual abuse. So I stopped asking that question. That question was, what was their earliest sexual memory? And I had wanted people to tell me about, like when they first knew about sex, but I didn't expect a lot of those memories to be bound up with experiences of being abused. And that was kind of a surprise. At the same time, for a lot of women, it wasn't like that was the end of the story, right? It wasn't like, because I think people sort of make all these assumptions if you've been abused as a child that you're not going to have a good sex life or you're going to be miserable, and I felt like many women had found ways to heal from that experience or had found ways to, like, in a sense, compartmentalize it, and were finding agency in their lives and in their experiences. Yeah, but that was the thing that surprised me the most.
Yeah, yeah. And it's hard. And I was wondering, as you were just saying that, I was wondering, how do you handle that? Like those conversations. Um, I think in across the book, but I can imagine even more vividly in the conversations. Yes, there's joy. There's freedom and resistance, but there's a lot of trauma. That's also jumped up from the pages for me. Like there's just so much trauma, and I think it's a balance, right? Like I'm like, yes, there's trauma ends, but also there's freedom, and I'm thinking, yes, there's freedom, but also there's that trauma, and it links back to what you were saying earlier about all the conversations that we're not having around sexuality, all the conversations that we're not having with our mothers, with our aunties, and all of those who we now need to give this book to. Please have this translated into French because I have a long list of aunties who don't read English, and but I
I
was
would
just
love for it to be translated into French. I mean, we basically need some French publishing houses to buy rights. So anybody who wants to do so, holla at me. I'll put you in touch with my agent. Or if you look on my website, it has details for my agent. Contact him.
Let me say that in French. Est-ce que vous avez entendu? We need the book in French, please. Yes, indeed. I think it would be really fantastic to have it in more, as many languages as possible. I was thinking about all those silences and all those conversations that we're not having. And I think this is why your work is so important, right? So, and I really know it's only the beginning from you and others because you're giving permission. You've given permission to many of us to do many things and to say many things for years. And I think this book is super important in that regard. I'm now thinking, maybe it's because you were mentioning your daughter just now, and I'm thinking about those conversations that we want to have because we know those silences didn't work for us, and yet I just find it so difficult still, because we know what the conversation should be about, but we still don't know how to have those conversations, even among ourselves, with our peers, and let alone with the women of tomorrow, like who we are educating now. And I was just wondering how are you thinking about that? And how do you think like the work that you're doing can help with that?
Yeah. So yes, obviously this is something I'm yet to experience, but I have been thinking about it. And I guess I've been practicing it in a different way. I'm also godmother to, a 16-year-old girl. And we've had conversations about sex, funny enough, for a podcast. So it's a conversation that we're having that was also being recorded. But part of what I did was buy her some great books written by African feminists. Dr. T's Guide to Sexual Health, Tiffany Mugu's A Quick Guide to Sex. And I'm like, read this book and let's have a discussion. And yeah, like I felt super proud of her because she recently asked her mom to buy her a sex toy. And that made me feel happy. She hasn't yet had sex with somebody else, but I was happy that somehow she already knows, right? So that part of what I need to work on is self pleasure and figuring out things for myself. You know, at her young age of 16, she recognizes that she's bisexual. I had definitely had sexual relationships with girls when I was that age, but I hadn't thought about, oh, what does this mean in terms of my sexuality? I had no idea what sexuality meant. So I also feel like young people today will have access to more language, which is really important, right? Like language gives you a framework to understand yourself and the world. But I think the thing to do is just to answer questions as they come to you, to make yourself open to, your children, to let them know the names of body parts, to let them see things. Like I know a lot of mothers have this where their children just follow them into the bathroom all of the time, right? So my child follows me into the bathroom. She's watching me as I'm trying to fit a menstrual cup. And she's like really peering, of course, trying to understand what's the strange thing I'm doing. When she's old enough, I'll explain to her what I'm doing when she has the language to ask me. I don't plan to hide things from them. I think that's what I want to do, like to try and just be open so that she's able to answer questions and to try and figure out child appropriate ways of explaining things. One of the things I'm really, really interested in doing is writing a children's book. I don't know what the subject will be about, but maybe it'll be about sex and it would maybe be a guide to teaching young people about sex. I have to figure it out before I can write about it, but also writing about it is part of how I figure things out. So it may come, sooner rather than later.
Well, I cannot wait. Please, some of these people I have at home are growing too fast, so please write the book. We are waiting. Well, before I go, come back to you, Poetra. I'm going to remind to say thanks again to everyone who's joining us on YouTube and on Facebook Live. If you have any questions, please send us our way so that we make time for answering your questions as well. Poetra, welcome back. Sorry you're experiencing some difficulties with your connection, and I understand you're not trying to do without the video, but we are so glad you are here. I wanted to ask you
Yes, I hope
maybe,
you can hear me.
yes, we can hear you much better. So I wanted to ask you, Poetra, about your
Great.
work and a little bit about how the work that you do echoes or you find echo in the work that Nadia presented in this book. How did you find it echoing with your work and your intentions?
I think what really echoed for me was in some of the women who talked about their childhood or their teenagehood, how their childhood, how they were raised, whether it was in their homes with their parents, or whether it was in the church, or whether it was in the community, how it affected their sexuality or their sexual lives or their romantic lives. It really resonated with my work because something that I've been exploring in my fiction is women pushing back on the narrative of sex with themselves. I have a story on a girl exploring masturbation, and it's a story. It was one of the first stories that was placed in a journal online, and I remember being very skeptical about sharing that story because, like some of the women who were portrayed in that book, I was also raised in a Christian home. And my parents I had a slightly different experience. My parents weren't shrouded about sex. They were people who were were quite open about sex and making sure that you were safe when you were having sex. At the same time, I live in an African family. I belong to an African family, and people are always talking. Your child did this, your daughter did this and this and this and that. So I was very worried about how other people would think. And so one of the ways in which I've really been exploring or going against the grain or rebelling is writing about sex, the way I wish I could speak about sex. And so that really resonated with me, just seeing people talk about how their teenagehood and their childhood affected their adult lives, their adult sexualities. And that's something that I have been exploring in my work for some time now.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Petra. And I think um, it's really interesting what you're saying about the background and the family context that we have. And I think when I read this, initially I read the book. I know it was about African women and the diversity of like the Africanness that we have, right? And interestingly, Nana Darkoa, you
Mm-hmm.
also chose to expand what African mean because you have women, African women or women from African descent, from the diaspora. And for me, it was a bit of a surprise. So I want to ask you a little bit about that choice to have also an expansive, not a definition, not just of sex, but also of African. Like we take all of the words in the title and all of them are expanded. So explain, please.
Actually, it's so funny because I got asked this question as well yesterday when I was in a gathering with East African feminists. And I guess I hadn't realized that people would find that like surprising. But I'm a Pan Africanist, right? And so for me, I recognize Africans in the diaspora as part of the continent. And I recognize that there are a whole group of people who were separated from the continent through slavery, through colonization, right? And more modern times through migration. And I guess I want to claim all my people as my people, and until a few years ago, for example, I hadn't realized how many Afro descendants were in Latin America. And I was just like, whoa, like that was a big surprise to me. I went to Brazil, to Bahia in Brazil, and people were speaking to me in Portuguese because they thought I was Brazilian. I have never been anywhere outside of the continent where I have felt so much like this could be this could be my home. This food is like my food from my home. And that's how I experienced it in Bahia. So I was just seeing the interconnectedness between African people, and many of these people in the diaspora are also marginalized, also suffer from racism, also suffer from a lot of the challenges that we experience here on the continent. And I guess I just want to claim all my people. And yes, so for me, Afro descendants are Africans, and it's a political choice to recognize them as Africans. It was deliberate for me that this book was not called The Sex Lives of Black Women. It's The Sex
Mm,
Lives of African Women for a reason. Yeah.
that's great. Thank you, Nana. As you're thinking about like the politics, I want to turn to feminism. And I think I mean, of course, now I think the issue of sexuality is one of the most divisive within feminist movements. Uh, from my experience, from the conversations I've been in, like it's just like one of those, and the issues around it, like sexual identities, control over our sex lives, abortion rights, like there's a host of issues that are around our sexuality, and I think your book is um, an interesting contribution to that, um, and maybe a reminder of how the political is personal and the personal is political. I thought it was really interesting from that respect. I'm going to ask you a bit more about that in a moment, but maybe I will ask Poetra from your perspective. You talked about how it echoed with your art, and I'm asking you now, how did all of that echo with your politics when you read the book? Hi, Poetra, we can't hear you. I don't know if you're still here. So maybe while you come back to us, I'm going to ask the my question to Nana then. Nana, can you tell us a little bit about the how this
So
is? Sorry, sorry, Petra. There's still a bit of delay on the line, so I'm going to ask again. If you heard my question, can you answer now? I'm so sorry, Petra. I can only hear silence. So I'm going to ask you, Nana, to tell us a little bit about the.
can you hear me now?
We can hear you with delay, so I don't know how far you are. I don't know what I'm doing now. I don't know who I'm talking to. I'm so sorry, Poetra. I'm confused. Ah, she's gone. Oh, sorry. Okay, while I hope she comes back with a more stable connection, I'm going back to you, Nana Darkoa, with the question about how this is feminist work. I mean, it's obvious, I think, for us feminists, but I think when you look out a little bit of like in the feminist movements, and even in that movement, some parts who are a bit less. I mean, for me personally, I think this is a very liberating book from a feminist perspective, as well as from a like personal perspective. But I also can imagine how divisive a book this is within the movement. Have you encountered some of it yet, or not yet?
The
And
short
what does that
answer
look
is
like?
no. I haven't encountered any divisiveness yet. Or maybe if there is, it hasn't yet been brought to my attention, which is fine actually, you know. I'm actually okay with people not necessarily agreeing with me, or I'm also okay if people won't like the book. You know, I feel like the people I wrote it for, they would get it and it would resonate with them. And so far, that's the feedback I've been hearing, which is very fortunate.
Fantastic.
Yes.
That's fantastic. And so, as a feminist offering, like what do you how do you see this being a contribution to the like largest like feminist thinking, which I do think it is, and I have my thoughts on that, but I would love to hear what your either what your intention was in that respect, or what you're seeing from the reactions.
Yeah, so in terms of intention, my intention was just basically to show what I need to be the reality, right? That when it comes to African women's sexuality, it's really broad. People have different experiences. You know, people are exploring, people are on journeys, people are trying to figure out things for themselves. And I knew this from, basically curating adventures for many, many years. But those were not the stories that I would tend to see, especially in mainstream Western media. I felt like when it came to sexuality, people portrayed African women in extremely limited ways. We were either women who, were vectors of disease like HIV and AIDS, or we didn't have access to sanitary towels, or we had experienced FGM. And yes, all of those things may be true, but I knew there was so much more. And so I love that even when a story maybe it coincides with a sort of mainstream stereotype, you see a whole lot more. Like I love that, in Wara's story. I mean, Wara's story is like, for me, I was interviewing Wara, she was telling me, and she was describing FGM as child sexual abuse, and I was having like a wow, I had never thought of FGM as child sexual abuse. But when you think about it as child sexual abuse, you also recognize that child sexual abuse happens all around the world. So it doesn't become this thing that you kind of exoticize and think, oh, it's something that these savages over there do, right? But then also, in speaking to her, I even realized how sometimes, even when you're a feminist and even when you've really tried to re educate yourself, you sometimes get stuck in stereotypes. Because she was describing to me like an amazing orgasm she'd experienced. And I was kind of stuck in my head thinking, but how did you experience this orgasm when you don't have a clit? This was literally what I was thinking in my head. Of course, I couldn't ask that question. I had to find a really sort of diplomatic way to ask. And she was like, remember that the clitoris is really expansive. And I was just like, oh my goodness, yes. I mean, I know this intellectually. I've seen diagrams of the clitoris, and we all know it's far bigger than the penis. But the narrative that's in my head is if you're a woman who's experienced FGM, you can't have pleasurable sex, and that's not true. And so for me, like that's the full story. Like I wanted to show a much fuller story than the stories I would see in the media. Um, and now I can't remember. I feel like I've answered one part of your question, but not the initial part.
Okay, that's okay. Perfect. Thank you so much. Poetra, welcome back. Let's give it another try. I can't remember what I was asking. I think I was asking you about how politically, for you, how this the book itself from the sexuality aspect of feminist resonates for you as a feminist.
Hmm. Yes. So I remember when you asked Nana a question earlier in our conversation, and she was explaining what this book was doing, expanding freedom, and not just in sexuality, but in hearts. And she mentioned something about the freedom in collective assembly, right? In us being able to, just come together. That also was was one of the intentions for when she was writing this book. And I think that really that's one of the things that this book aligns with my politics. It's the freedom for us to have this space, to have as many identities as possible. And identity is very much linked to our sexuality, and our identity is linked to our is what identity is political. Who you identify as is how you are treated to in the entire world, in who you relate to, and how you are identified as. And so for me, this is not just about your sexuality. It's not just about your romantic life, but it's also about your identity. And I think that is very political.
Great. Thank you so much, Poetra. I was thinking about the structure of the book. Nana Darkoa. I think self-discovery, when you talked about sexuality, it feels self-explanatory. And then we've talked a lot about freedom. I would love to talk about healing, which is like kind of about the third or the final third of the book. And I think it was part of the beautiful surprises. Like I didn't see the book was going there when I started, and so I would love to talk, to hear from you about the choice of focusing on healing and the kind of the connection between sexuality and healing, and have you what you've learned about this story.
Hmm. Yeah. So, but the last, what did I learn about? I missed the last bit of what you said.
I was saying I just want to hear about healing and like your intention to when you were choosing about healing, but also to talk about healing, but also what have you learned about this sexuality and healing connection from the stories?
Mm, yes. Yeah. So, I mean, in a sense, how those themes came about is basically based on the conversations that I was having with people. So once I had done about, I didn't sort of start off thinking I'm going to do self-discovery, freedom, and healing, right? I just started off having conversations and just like interviewing people and just like thinking about those conversations. And then once I'd had about interviews with about 20 people, I did the very usual nerdy thing of putting everybody in a spreadsheet and writing down some of the common words, that for me were like themes coming across. And healing was one of those themes, self discovery was one of those themes, freedom was one of those themes. I felt like that came across in a lot of conversations, right? And of course, one conversation could encompass all of that. But then I thought, actually, this makes sense. This is how I'm going to divide the book. I'm going to divide the book into these three sections. and what I sort of debated about was really where to start, right? Because in a sense, even in the book, I'm trying to take people on a bit of a journey. And in the long run, I made the decision to start with self discovery because I felt like that is where most people would see themselves and, be able to kind of relate. And then we go to something that's, a bit more inspirational, I hope. And then there's also the reality. I felt like healing was like a reality. The need to heal was something that was coming across really strongly. And so I remember like my US editor, a couple of stories where she was like, there's no healing in here because she was hoping for a story that would actually tell of how somebody has healed. And I was like, no, that's because they need to heal. And like my story is in the healing section as well, right? Because I think that was one of the realizations that I had in speaking to people. Some people I'm like, oh, wow, they've actually taken the time to heal. That's super important. And it feels to me like something that's important to do, but at the same time, it feels to me that's something that's difficult to do for a whole host of reasons, right? I think, and this is kind of like my current conclusion, healing requires a lot of space and time. You can't just sort of fit it in amongst your everyday life, amongst everything that's going on. You can't be like working around the clock, looking after your child after work, and still find space and time to heal. Of course, healing looks different for everybody. For some people, healing will be therapy. Some people, healing is celibacy. For some people, healing is actually sex. Good sex is also healing. And it takes time to figure that out. And I think that for me was kind of like the connection between healing and sexuality. It's not like you go from one to the other. In a way, if we lived in a linear world, you might think, oh, if I heal from all my trauma, then I will have amazing sex. I don't think that's the case, right? um yeah, it just feels like it's all connected, but not in a neat linear form.
Yeah. For Richard, did you also find
Okay.
the healing
So
theme? Please go ahead,
I'm going
Poetry.
to answer that in a second, Francoise. But I had a question for Nana Darkoa. I had a question for Nana, and
I'm ready.
so Nana, in the freedom section, yeah, in the freedom section, yeah, there was this line about it's there's no wonder that the women who are most free or who were emphasizing the concept of freedom were women who either identified as bi, cisgender, polyamorous, etc. And there's something that Bell Hooks has said in one of her feminism is in women controlling their own bodies, and how radical cisgender women have come to identify, just like how their bi and polyamorous women have been saying all the time, that it's hard, men are not going to allow for freedom, for women to exercise their freedom. And I found that theme very present in your book. So I guess my question is, what does the future look like? What do you think the future looks like for cisgender straight women? And do you think that this literature that we are working on, exploring?
So I think I had the first part of Poetry's question, which was, what does the future look like for cisgendered straight women? And I feel like there's a second part that I didn't hear, Poetry. But you can also put that in the chat. Ooh, but this is a tough question, Poetry. You want me to gaze into a crystal ball, and also, yeah, no, I mean, for me, like, again, it wasn't even something that I was expecting to see. But of course, once I saw it, I was just like, this makes sense, right? I didn't go into this project thinking that, oh, in a sense, the women who would experience the most freedom are women who are poly or like women who are queer. That was not my thinking at all. But the minute I saw it, I was like, yeah, that's a surprise. And in fact, that makes a lot of sense, because I think part of how we experience freedom is by breaking out of the boxes society places us in, right? And I feel like if you break out of one box, it's much easier to break out of the others. And when we live in a world that basically tries to enforce compulsory heterosexuality, people who have questioned that, people who have resisted that, people who have recognized that this is not my portion in a sense, you know, they've broken free of some sort of chains. And so, yeah, I feel like that alone allows them to access other types of freedom. Um, and I mean, I hope what straight cisgendered women take from this as inspiration, you know, yeah, inspiration to also resist whatever chains they themselves experience. Um, I hope they also take inspiration to experiment, to figure out what freedom would look like for them in their own relationships, to even try and renegotiate existing relationships. I feel like even if you're in a relationship and you've been in that relationship for like a decade, there's no reason why you need to, the terms of that relationship cannot change, you know? For me, that's something that's also possible. Um, I also feel like, yeah, cisgendered women are questioning a lot of these traditions and also these norms, and are also on journeys of self-discovery. And I think the journey is really important, right? And I don't think there's also a final destination. I don't think, you know, you're going to get to this stop and be like, hey, I've arrived at freedom, you know? So I think also the journey is also one that we should all learn to enjoy.
Yeah, and you do say in the book that actually I remember reading specifically those words that it's not it's a journey, and there's no point at which we feel we have arrived. Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you so much for Etra for the question. I was so I'm going through my notes. Huh? I have so many, but I remember thinking about how this was about the sex lives, our lives as sexual women, as women, and our sex lives, right? As sex lives, but also all the way in which the word out there is reflected in the book. Where I remember there was the story from Amina in Egypt who was saying, so I quote, something happened during the 2011 revolution in Egypt. It was as someone whispered, let's break all our mental chains too. And then she explains how like the political revolution has been also a revolution for her own sexual life. And then I also remember reading from Maureen's story, who is like a Ivorian woman who was living in France and talking about how, like dating black guys and what that meant for her as a political choice, not just. And I was thinking about just the sexual life that we live individually, how we think about it sometimes as political, but also I think the book helped me think about how the politics of the world are in our sex lives. That for me was a learning also in the book, and I was wondering if you had thought about that. I'm sure you have. And what were your thoughts, Darkoa?
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, that was also like super interesting that you'd be having a very specific individual conversation with a woman, and that conversation is illustrating sort of larger systemic problems or illustrating larger issues in the world. And Maureen's is a great example, right? I think it's a great example of how Black women and white majority societies are really at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to desirability. You know, like a lot of us, myself included, love Lupin, that show, popular show on Netflix. And I've seen people on Twitter saying, how come he hasn't got any black women in his life, right? And I mean, I feel like Maureen's story speaks to that, right? Where somehow in France, black women are not shown as desirable, as partners, as people who are chosen, and that came across really, really strongly. But yeah, I also loved Amina's story because it's also like, like we say, the person is political, but it's also very clear that there's the other way around. It's also possible from her story, right? And resisting state oppression and violence also allowed her to resist an oppression that's like was a lot more deeply personal, and also allowed her to create community with other activists. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Nana Darkoa. Poetra, do you want to add to that?
I think what I want to add is, for me, this book is really helping normalize conversations around sex. And that's very, very important. That's something that has to be done more. And that's what I find was the most compelling thing about this book, that it is normalizing conversations around our sexuality and sex.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And what I really also love about the book from that perspective is that I've seen books that try to reflect the diversity of experiences, of sexual experiences, and then they create boxes. There'll be like trans sexualities and all, and then they'll have like like there's this difference, and they create the boxes as they try to tell us there are no boxes. And what I loved about the book is like, you know, you go from a woman in the diaspora to a woman somewhere in Cote d'Ivoire, and then you go to Senegal, and then you have somebody who's experiencing this from this identity and from that identity, and it's just all there, and that it makes all of us, not there's no box. We're all here. There's no normality. I love that about the book, and so yes, completely agree with you, Poetra. I'm going to ask a question that is coming from the comments. Thank you, Fatima. If you had come across Nana Darkoa, if that's for you, if you had come across this book as a 20-year-old, what stories, what learnings from the book do you think you could have been most impactful based on your experience of sex and sexuality in your early 20s? Well, that's a
Oh,
great
I love
question. Thanks,
that.
Fatima. That's a great question.
I love that as a question. I think if I'd come across this book in my 20s before I got married, because I got married really early, and I'm no longer married anyway, I think I would have known not to get married as early as I got married, and I'd have given myself space and time to explore and to, yeah, go on a journey of self-discovery at an early age, rather than what I think I did in reality, which was to start that journey at 30, and I'm still on that journey, and I'm 43 now, so that goes to show.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really great question. I think if I had read in my 20s, I think I would have been like, I would have understood the value of freedom a lot earlier. I think. I think it's just like, and that freedom is not an ideal. Like that freedom is a practice. I think I would have probably gotten that, and I can't wait for some of my future 20-year-olds coming, my nieces, and I just think it's going to such an important book for them. I have one last question. Uh, I think this book shows us the importance of sexuality and of sex. And yet, I remember as I literally stopped to laugh halfway in the book. I was reading Gabriella's story, which starts by "sex is overrated," and I was like, "Yes, yes." It's so interesting that in a book about the importance of sexuality, we have a story that says sex is overrated. And like, are we taking sex too seriously? Really, it's a question I had at that point in the book. What do you both think about that?
I'll let Portia go first.
Mm.
I feel like I can hear Portia in the background
I think
saying
that was
something.
definitely one of the things I loved about the book. Even from the samples that we picked, I think whoever made that decision was also very smart for us to pick different views of sex. And I agree that I agree that the public discourse of sex is overrated. That I agree. I think the what we discuss in public about sex is overrated, and that we don't actually expand on what sex can be. That is missing. But what is currently happening in public, yeah, it's overrated.
Thank you for it. What about you?
I
So
feel
it's
like
not
I feel
overrated
like
or
I want to hear more from Portia about what exactly is overrated, and because I'm not sure if I know what she's talking about, right? And I'm making assumptions. Yeah. So, what do you feel is overrated when it comes to the public discussion about sex? What kind of public discussions, in particular, do you have in mind?
The conservative view of sex, what is like you mentioned, sex is more than just penetrative sex. The cuddling, the foreplay, which is the main play for a lot of women,
Okay, that I agree with. Yes, I agree with in terms of like the limited discussions around sex. Yeah. Francois, so your question was, do I think sex is overrated?
I think I would no, it's my question is prompted by that statement by Gabriella in the book, which is I know it's an odd question to ask you because you've done all that work around sex, right? But I'm thinking, I really thought at this point, are we taking all of this too seriously?
I feel like
Um,
we're not taking it seriously enough, to be honest. I feel like we don't take it seriously enough, and in a sense, sex and conversations about sex is treated as an add-on if it gets discussed at all. It's felt very much to be kind of like a luxury, a concern that only privileged, women and people have time for, and that other things are more important. And I think sex is important. It's important in every area of our life. It's linked to the public. I mean, if it wasn't important, first of all, we wouldn't have states and governments trying to legislate who we sleep with and who we can't sleep with. It's also about labor and labor rights. There are people who work with sex and their work is criminalized and they get arrested and they get assaulted by police officers who whip them, who bribe them. you know um, People get beaten up because of their sexual identities. And so I actually feel like we don't talk enough about sex, and we don't like we need to rate it a lot more highly than we do. Yeah.
hmm, I think if I was to ask this question, I feel like that we don't take it seriously in the right ways. I think the people who
Yes.
take it very seriously, people who take it seriously, too seriously even, are people who are using it for control. And they take it and the way we take it more seriously is for freedom, for pleasure. Those are super important, and we don't take that seriously. So, yeah, for me, it was a very profound thing that is really reflected also from the very. Thank you so much. I want to ask if there are any more questions because I have to say I've run out of questions. So please help me here. I'm hearing, thank you so much for the discussion. Very happy to be here, excited to be here. Hello, everyone in the comments. I see excitement, no question. Because maybe there's so much clarity in what you've all offered. um, so what I'll do is basically ask each of you if there's something that you really wanted to talk about tonight that you wanted to cover, maybe a few minutes, and then I'll close.
If there's anything we
Portia,
want Is there
Yeah,
something
maybe
I want?
something that you didn't get a chance to say today that you really care about, that you thought you would have wanted to set that you comfortable of that.
I mean, I want people to share with me. So it's more like a request to people who are watching and are interested in this whole conversation around sex. I really want to read and research more around traditional African tools of pleasure. Like we know about Kachabali from like Eastern Africa. I'm interested in things like that. What are the traditional African rituals when it comes to sex? Especially any that people can think of that are feminist. I really want to read and research and learn more about that. So I'd appreciate people sharing that with me. Find me on Twitter. My handle is NAS009.
Thank you so much, Nana Darkoa. Poetra, anything you want to add?
I Yes. So I hope that this book encourages, inspires more women to write about their sex lives. Now that we know that
Yeah.
sex life means a lot of things, I want more women to write and share. I hope that there are book clubs who, even if there are just 5 books, I hope there are 30 women who rotate every month who just by reading these stories can start writing about their own sex lives, even if it means to write and say, I have never had sex before, or I had bad sex, or I had great sex. And so that's what I hope comes out of this book.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Actually, I think that for me, this book is the beginning of a conversation. I've bought so many copies of this book, sent them across the seas to my friends so we can talk about it. And I think for me, there's just so many conversations that can come with it. Some of them are conversations with myself. I've used some of these stories as journaling prompts. I think there's a lot more work that we can do around this, and a lot more of the
Hmm.
conversations. So please translate the book, buy the book. Christmas is coming. Share the book, discuss the book, and I think there's just a lot that will come from all of that. And again, Nana Dakoa, you've proven to be a pioneer. Opening, you did it first. Now you're telling us it's okay. Nobody beat your head. You're still here. You're opening that door for all of us, and I'm so grateful and so proud of you for that. And yes, I think there's just so many conversations, and I'm really privileged that I got to be with both of you in one of those conversations. If that's okay, Fatima, I know we're not at time yet, but I am against talking when I have nothing to say. So,
Can I just say
if,
one last thing? Thank you,
yes, of course.
Poetra, for like saying like you really want us to inspire women to share their own stories about sex, because that's really what we've also been trying to do with adventures. And I know sometimes it's affirming to be able to share your story and have people respond and read it and say, yes, I've had that experience as well. So if this book inspires you to write your story about sex, feel free to send it to us and we will consider publishing on Adventures. And the website is www.adventuresfrom.com. And there's a section on the website which will tell you how to send in your story. So please do. Super important. And yeah, I just want to also appreciate Poetra. Poetra is one of the artists in Ghana that I have the deepest admiration for. Like, I feel like she is such a multi talented artist. I don't know how one person can be so talented. She's a writer, she's a poet, she's a designer, she creates cards. I'm just like, how do you get to be so freaking talented, Poetra? You have a magazine. Yeah. So I know, and you recently also launched a publishing house. So you're also one of those people creating spaces for women to share their stories. So I just really want to appreciate you. And I want to appreciate you, Francoise, for Ayala, for all that you do, for all that you're currently doing for us with AWDF. It's been really incredible being in conversation with the two of you, both women that I so deeply admire and love.
So much. And yes, Poetra, now that I know you are such a fantastic human being, can we meet? Apparently, the three of us are in Accra, so we need to take this time.
I know, right?
but for now, thank you so much. Thank you also to the Adventures Life team for this beautiful day of powerful conversations. Thank you for to everyone who was sending love in the comments. Thank you for being with us. And thanks for everybody who's going to share this conversation to their friends who missed out. This is going to stay on YouTube, right? So it stays on for prosperity,
Yes,
as we
we
say.
do.
Yes. So I say thank you so much, gratitude, so much love. The sex lives of African women is out, should be bought, should be given, gifted, scribbled upon, put some notes in it, reread it, and discuss it. Thank you so much. And back to you, Fatima, and everybody who's running this beautiful show. Thank you.